Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. Today we'll be reviewing The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pappe. I did a review of this last October, about a week after the events of October the 7th. I'll put a link to that in the card above. That review was a big picture perspective of the book. Today I'd like to focus on 5 key takeaways. The first is, what is the definition of ethnic cleansing? So we have a quote from the European Journal of International Law. Ethnic cleansing is a well-defined policy of a particular group of persons to systematically eliminate another group from a given territory on the basis of religious, ethnic, or national origin. Such a policy involves violence and is very often connected with military operations. It is to be achieved by all possible means, from discrimination to extermination, and entails violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Most ethnic cleansing methods are grave breaches of the 1949 Geneva Conventions and 1977 additional protocols. So I think I just want to address this at the outset because one of the comments I got on the videos last year, either from ignorance or malice, is, oh, well, there are millions of Palestinians today. I guess the Israelis do a terrible job of ethnic cleansing. And just the ignorance behind that ethnic cleansing does not only mean murder. It obviously can. It mentions from discrimination to extermination. Obviously, you can cleanse a territory of a people by killing them, but you can also do that by displacing them, by bombing them, terrorizing them, making them flee, and then closing the borders so that they can't come back in, right? So when we talk about ethnic cleansing, you have to see that it is something that has happened, it is something that has continued to happen, and the idea that the Israelis are not capable of this, it just simply flies in the face of the facts. Not only what happened in 1948, but we see it happening in the West Bank. We see it with the Settler Project. We see it with what happened in Gaza prior to 2006, and then obviously what has happened in Gaza since. That the idea of having an ethnically pure or an Israel that's free of anyone but Jews was imagined by Zionists prior to 1948, and this atmosphere existed. Benny Morris talks about this in the Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited. I'll put a link to that video in the description. But this is just a reality of things. And if people want to pretend that ethnic cleansing did not happen in 1948, or they're very offended or triggered by the title of the book, they just have to do the research and find out. And that comes to my second point. The research will lead you to something called Plan Dalet. Now, Plan Dalet was the fourth, because it's the fourth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, was the fourth plan of what to do when the British leave. Because the idea was the British were going to leave, and how was Israel going to secure itself? And one of the ways it was going to secure itself was by getting rid of the Palestinians. This is a direct quote from Plan Dalet. These operations can be carried out in the following manner, either by destroying villages, by setting fire to them, by blowing them up, and by planting mines in the debris. Why would you plant mines in the debris? In case someone comes back and tries to find their stuff and then they get killed as well. And especially of those population centers which are difficult to control continuously, or by mounting combing and control operations according to the following guidelines. Encirclement of the villages, conducting a search inside them. In case of resistance, the armed forces must be wiped out and the population expelled outside the borders of the state. Now keep in mind, what if there are no armed forces? What if it's just a group of villagers? Did they get a pass? No. So the idea of referring to villages as enemy bases and referring to quote-unquote armed forces, that didn't matter. If there were no armed villagers, if there was no resistance, they were still murdered, killed, and expelled. In February 1947, the decision was made by the British cabinet to pull out of Mandatory Palestine and leave it to the UN to solve the question of its future. The UN took 9 months to deliberate the issue and then adopted the idea of partitioning the country. This was accepted by the Zionist leadership, who, after all, championed partition, but was rejected by the Arab world and the Palestinian leadership, who instead suggested keeping Palestine a unitary state and who wanted to solve the situation through a much longer process of negotiation. The partition resolution was adopted on the 29th of November 1947, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine began in early December 1947 with a series of Jewish attacks on Palestinian villages and neighborhoods in retaliation for the buses and shopping centers that had been vandalized in the Palestinian protest against the UN resolution during the first few days after its adoption. Though sporadic, these early Jewish assaults were severe enough to cause the exodus of a substantial number of people, almost 75,000. On the 9th of January, units of the 1st All-Arab Volunteer Army entered Palestine and engaged with the Jewish forces in small battles over routes and isolated Jewish settlements. Easily winning the upper hand in these skirmishes, the Jewish leadership officially shifted its tactics from acts of retaliation to cleansing operations. Coerced expulsions followed in the middle of February 1948, when Jewish troops succeeded in emptying 5 Palestinian villages in one day. On the 10th of March 1948, Plan Dalet was adopted. The first targets were the urban centers of Palestine, which had all been occupied by the end of April. About 250,000 Palestinians were uprooted in this phase, which was accompanied by several massacres, most notable of which was the Deir Yassin massacre. Aware of these developments, the Arab League took the decision on the last day of April to intervene militarily, but not until the British mandate had come to an end. So remember that point as well, that the idea of 6 Arab armies invaded us, that there was no invasion of anything prior to the 15th of May 1948, when Israel had declared unilaterally its independence. They were already expelling Palestinians inside the area marked out by the UN for the Jewish state, which would mean they were expelling their own Palestinian citizens during that time period. So no one had invaded them. These were just villagers who were living there. They hadn't signed a contract to invade Israel. They were just living there, and they were expelled because they could not be considered safe. The Israeli government considered them as a fifth column, as threats, and so they had to be expelled, even though they didn't necessarily have any weapons, even though some of them had signed peace treaties, even though some of them were peaceable. They all had to go. So the idea of 6 Arab armies invaded us, and there was chaos, and people left. In the very first phase, prior to the 15th of May, cleansing operations were already happening. No hostilities from the Arabs as a whole, right? So this idea of 6 Arab armies invaded us, and this is what we had to do respond, it's simply contrary to the facts of the case. The British left on the 15th of May 1948, and the Jewish Agency immediately declared the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, officially recognized by the 2 superpowers of the day, the USA and the USSR. That same day, regular Arab forces entered Palestine. A little note, Israel did not declare what its borders were when it declared independence, nor did it declare a constitution. To this day, it has not done either of those things. Make of that what you will. By February 1948, the American administration had already concluded that the UN partition resolution, far from being a peace plan, was proving a recipe for continued bloodshed and hostility. Therefore, it twice offered alternative schemes to halt the escalation of the conflict: a trusteeship plan for 5 years in February 1948, and a 3-month ceasefire on the 12th of May. The Zionist leadership rejected both peace proposals out of hand. The official Zionist strategy was fed throughout this period by 2 impulses. The first consisted of ad hoc reactions to 2 startling developments on the ground. One was the fragmentation, if not total disintegration, of the Palestinian political and military power systems, and the other, the growing disarray and confusion within the Arab world in the face of the aggressive Jewish initiatives and the simultaneous international endorsement of the Zionist project and the future Jewish state. So how does that happen? Well, remember, prior to this time, we don't have the internet. We don't have any other way of communicating other than newspapers and rumor. And so when the next point that I'm going to make, the Deir Yassin massacre, happens, it has a tremendous effect on other peoples. They're thinking, this is going to happen to me next. I'm not armed. I'm not trained in the military. I'm going to flee. And keep in mind that there had been instability in the region before. The Arab Revolt happened in 1936 to 1939. Some families had left during that period, and they had come back. So it isn't the first time that there has been instability in a region or war in a region and people have left and come back. The difference is that Israel had decided that the Palestinians would not be allowed back. And part of that ties to, you have to understand the way that the Zionists saw that this was their last stand, they couldn't leave. And so any time that kibbutzim were under attack and they wanted to surrender or they wanted to evacuate, they were told no. I'm trying to remember any instance in Benny Morris's book of 1948, which I can also link to in the description, in which kibbutzim were allowed to evacuate, but I don't think so. And it's a different way that the Israelis thought about their land. They were fighting for it. This is our land, and we're going to keep it. Whereas the Palestinians, as civilians, not trained in the same method or not trained in the same thinking as the Zionists, were happy to leave if they didn't have any weapons with which to defend their land. If they're being bombed by military troops, they're going to evacuate and potentially try to come back when it's safer. That is a totally reasonable thing to do. And from the Zionist side, it's seen as cowardice. It's seen that people were not really, they didn't really care about the land. But that's just crazy. It was crazy to think that. The systematic nature of Plan Dalet is manifested in Deir Yassin, a pastoral and cordial village that had reached a non-aggression pact with the Haganah in Jerusalem, but was doomed to be wiped out because it was within the areas designated in Plan Dalet to be cleansed. Because of the prior agreement they had signed with the village, the Haganah decided to send the Irgun and Stern Gang troops, so as to absolve themselves from any official accountability. So, we didn't do it. I know that we had an agreement with you, the Haganah, but these guys did it. The Irgun, the Stern, oh, they're bad actors. We didn't have anything to do with them. In the subsequent cleansings of friendly villages, even this ploy would no longer be deemed necessary. On the 9th of April 1948, again, this is before any invasion. This is before Israel declares independence. Jewish forces occupied the village of Deir Yassin. It lay on a hill west of Jerusalem, 800 meters above sea level and close to the Jewish neighborhood of Givat Shaul. The old village school serves today as a mental hospital for the Western Jewish neighborhood that expanded over the destroyed village. As they burst into the village, the Jewish soldiers sprayed the houses with machine gun fire, killing many of the inhabitants. The remaining villagers were then gathered in one place and murdered in cold blood, their bodies abused, while a number of the women were raped and then killed. Fahim Saidan, who was 12 years old at the time, recalled how he saw his family murdered in front of his eyes. They took us out one after the other, shot an old man, and when one of his daughters cried, she was shot too. Then they called my brother Muhammad and shot him in front of us, and when my mother yelled, bending over him, carrying my little sister Hudra in her hands, still breastfeeding her, they shot her too. Zaidan himself was shot as well while standing in a row of children the Jewish soldiers had lined up against a wall, which they then sprayed with bullets just for the fun of it before they left. He was lucky to survive his wounds. Recent research has brought down the accepted number of people massacred at Deir Yassin from 170 to 93. Of course, apart from the victims of the massacre itself, dozens of others were killed in the fighting and hence were not included in the official list of victims. However, as the Jewish forces regarded any Palestinian village as an enemy military base, the distinction between massacring people and killing them in battle was slight. One only has to be told that 30 babies were among the slaughtered at Deir Yassin to understand why the whole quantitative exercise, which the Israelis repeated as recently as April 2002 in the massacre in Jenin, is insignificant. At the time, the Jewish leadership proudly announced a high number of victims, so as to make Deir Yassin the epicenter of the catastrophe, a warning to all Palestinians that a similar fate awaited them if they refused to abandon their homes and take flight. 4 nearby villages were next: Kalunya, Saris, Beit Surik, and Bidu. Taking only an hour or so in each village, the Haganah units blew up the houses and expelled the people. Interestingly, or ironically if you wish, Haganah officers claimed they had to struggle with their subordinates in order to prevent a frenzy of looting at the end of each occupation. Ben Ari, who supervised the sappers unit that blew up the houses, recounts in his memoirs how he had single-handedly stopped the plunder of these villages. But this claim seems exaggerated to say the least, given that the peasants ran away with nothing, while their possessions found their way into the living rooms and farms of both soldiers and officers as wartime mementos. 2 villages in the same area were spared, Abu Gaush and Nabi Samuil. This was because their Mukhtars had developed a relatively cordial relationship with the local commanders of the Stern Gang. Ironically, this saved them from destruction and expulsion, as the Haganah wanted to demolish them. The more extremist group, the Stern Gang, now came to their rescue. This was, however, a rare exception, and hundreds of villages suffered the same fate as Kalunya and the Kastal. So the Deir Yassin massacre was pivotal in frightening many Palestinians who were not armed, they had no military training, and they thought this would be them next. And so Rather than taking to the internet to ask for the help for help from the world, they did the only sensible thing that a civilian would do, which is to flee. And as this continues to build, this momentum, you could say these victories, the idea then shifts as Pape alludes to, they don't have to pretend anymore that this is something defensive. We're just taking precautions. They just go for it. And here, there was no need, stressed Ben Gurion, to distinguish anymore between the innocent and the guilty. The time had come for inflicting collateral damage. This is a line of thinking that runs from the founding of Israel to 2024 and Benjamin Netanyahu. It is a continual line of thought. Danin recalled years later that Ben Gurion spelled out what collateral damage meant. Every attack has to end with occupation, destruction, and expulsion. Danin even claimed that some specific villages were discussed. So far we've talked about, as I said, 5 key takeaways today. What is the definition of ethnic cleansing? And why does it apply in this particular case? What is Plan Dalet? What is the Deir Yassin massacre? The fourth is the idea of they were told to flee, right? So if you talk to some Israelis who've been brainwashed by Israeli textbooks, they'll tell you that, quote unquote, their leaders told them to flee. Now, this is, not only is this not true, but the opposite is the case, that the Arab Legion and other armies that were fighting had to, at some point, send villagers back to their village at gunpoint. Benny Morris talks about this in 1948. He talks about this in The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, because these refugees were causing logistical problems for the Arab army. So they said, you have to go back to your village. You can't come to Jordan. We don't have extra supplies for you, and you're in the middle of our battle. So you need to go back to your village. And in some cases, they had to march them back at gunpoint. So there is simply no evidence. So this is a claim with no evidence. It should be clear by now that the Israeli foundational myth about a voluntary Palestinian flight the moment the war started in response to a call by Arab leaders to make way for invading armies holds no water. It is a sheer fabrication that there were Jewish attempts, as Israeli textbooks still insist today, to persuade Palestinians to stay. If there were evidence, would not the Zionist authorities trumpet it around and show, here was a radio broadcast, here is a document showing, yes, everyone should leave? But in fact, there is no such evidence because there was no such call. The British were monitoring radio transmissions, there were no such call. As we have seen, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had already been expelled by force before the war began, and tens of thousands more would be expelled in the first week of the war. For most Palestinians, the date of the 15th of May 1948 was of no special significance at the time. It was just one more day in the horrific calendar of ethnic cleansing that had started more than 5 months earlier. So, one of the myths is they were told to flee, and the other is that 6 Arab armies invaded us. Firstly, I'm doubtful as to whether most Israelis could talk about which of the 6 Arab armies were and what their deployment was. But the reality is that there are only 2 armies that had major action with the Haganah and with the IDF. The Arab Legion, which came from Jordan, which also commanded the Iraqi troops, stayed mostly in the West Bank due to a secret agreement that was already discussed with the Israelis prior to the war, that the idea for King Hussein was he was okay with a partition as long as Jordan could absorb what would be the West Bank. And so those troops, the Arab Legion, do not advance into UN demarcated territory for the Jewish state. They stay mostly in the West Bank. The exception to this is the Battle for Jerusalem. And both sides fought viciously over this for obvious reasons. The Egyptian army obviously did advance, but if you look at the Lebanese army, the Syrian army, there are reasons why the idea that 6 Arab armies invaded us and wanted to throw us into the ocean is specious. It doesn't hold up if you've taken the time to study what happened in 1948, and many people have done so. I'll put a link in the description to On Palestine, which discusses the military movements of every single one of the Arab armies. And the idea, again, they were told to flee and 6 Arab armies invaded us and this is what happened. It just doesn't hold water. These are just talking points that are taught to Israeli school children, but the Israeli school children are not given any evidence because when you ask them about it, they can't produce anything for you. They're just taught to repeat these slogans, but they don't mean anything. The last thing I want to talk about is the Jewish terrorists that killed Count Folke Bernadotte. Now, Folke Bernadotte was a Swedish nobleman and a diplomat, and in World War II, he had actually negotiated the release of a number of Danish Jews and tens of thousands of non-Jews from many prison camps. And that's why, after the war, he was chosen unanimously as the United Nations Security Council representative to deal with this crisis. And the text says, as president of the Swedish Red Cross, Bernadotte had been instrumental in saving Jews from the Nazis during the Second World War, and this was why the Israeli government had agreed to his appointment as a UN mediator. Here's the catch. They had not expected him to try to do for the Palestinians what he had done for the Jews only a few years before, which is care about them and try to save them. So here's some of what Bernadotte put forward in his proposal. He had 2-piece proposals. The final one he put forward the day after he was assassinated by Leahy. Once again, there was an investigation. We don't know who did it, but we're going to deplore it publicly, but we're really quite excited internally because any sort of compromise is anti-Semitic. Bernadotte wrote that in putting forward any proposal for the solution of the Palestine problem, one must bear in mind the aspiration of the Jews, the political difficulties and differences of opinion of the Arab leaders, the strategic interests of Great Britain, the financial commitment of the United States and the Soviet Union, the outcome of the war, and finally the authority and prestige of the United Nations. Now, whether or not you agree with any of those points, this is what he used to foreground his points, which I'll read now. Firstly, peace must return to Palestine, and every feasible measure should be taken to ensure that hostilities will not be resumed and that harmonious relations between Arab and Jew will ultimately be restored. 2. A Jewish state called Israel exists in Palestine, and there are no sound reasons for assuming that it will not continue to do so. 3. The boundaries of this new state must finally be fixed, either by formal agreement between the parties concerned or failing that by the United Nations. 4. And why is this not possible? Because you have to take it all over. You don't want any boundaries fixed because you want room for future expansion indefinitely into the future. There is, if you want, Google Greater Israel, and you can see that the map is much, much bigger. And this goes back to the Ze'ev Jabotinsky wing of people who, when they're talking about from the river to the sea, they mean the other side. They want to go to the Euphrates. They want all of this land. Adherence to the principle of geographical homogeneity and integration, which should be the major objective of the boundary arrangements, should apply equally to Arab and Jewish territories, whose frontiers should not therefore be rigidly controlled by the territorial arrangements envisaged in the resolution of the 29th of November. This was the partition resolution. The right of innocent people, uprooted from their homes by the present terror and ravages of war, to return to their homes should be affirmed and made effective, with assurance of adequate compensation for the property of those who may choose not to return. That's part of why he had to die. He wanted the right of return of refugees, which we know to this day, official Israeli policy is that can never ever happen. Why? Because then these people would outnumber us and we wouldn't have a Jewish state anymore. The city of Jerusalem, because of its religious and international significance and the complexity of interests involved, should be accorded special and separate treatment. This is another reason he had to die. The idea that Jerusalem could be an international, specially controlled area, this was not acceptable to many of the hardliners. And finally, international responsibility should be expressed where desirable and necessary in the form of international guarantees as a means of allaying existing fears, and particularly with regard to boundaries and human rights. So, while you may not agree with all 7 of those points that Bernadotte put forward, those were not a reason for him to be assassinated. But he was assassinated by Jewish terrorists. And remember that when asked, Menachem Begin was asked on U.S. television what it felt like to be considered the father of terrorism in the Middle East, he replied, "No, the father of terrorism in the whole world." So this idea of terrorism as something new and exclusively Muslim is a narrative put forward by Netanyahu and other of his cronies who are not willing to look back at their own history and realize they were the primary terrorists in this land, and they continue to be so to this day. If you enjoyed this review, consider hitting like, subscribe to the channel, share this with people who you think are open-minded enough to actually hear about an alternative point of view and are not just willing to take Pappe's cancellation in 2006 for daring to publish this book and being, let's say, canceled out of Israel as worthy of reading. You can buy the book. I put a link to the description below. That's one way you can support the channel. Obviously, you can also support the channel by a one-time gift. I've got links to that below with Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. Or if you'd like to support in a more ongoing way, I've got links to Patreon, or you can become a YouTube member, and you'll get early releases of these videos. You'll also get some behind-the-scenes videos from me, as well as the opportunity to talk to me about my process and the reason I select these books, and sometimes what I don't include just because there's not enough time or it could be a distraction. Also, a reminder that for Palestine Bookshelf, a portion of the proceeds from all these different channels will go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. This is a wonderful organization that helps Palestinian children get medical care that they would not otherwise be able to get. Consider supporting them directly by going to their website and pledging, or supporting them indirectly by supporting our work. You'll find a link to their website in the description below. As always, enjoy your reading.